Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. My guest today is Richard Blackaby, and we are so excited to have Richard on Leadership Lessons podcast. Richard has leadership and ministry advice that's no doubt going to be good for all of us. Richard, thank you for taking the time to join Leadership Lessons.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
Yep. Let me tell you about Richard. Richard Blackaby is the president of Blackaby Ministries International and the eldest son of Henry and Marilyn. He has served as a senior pastor and a seminary president. He's authored and co-authored 40 books, travels extensively, and speaks internationally on spiritual leadership, experiencing God, revival, and God in the marketplace. This is very interesting. Richard regularly works with Christian CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. He and his wife, Lisa, live in Atlanta. Their 3 children all serve in ministry leadership. And they have 8 grandchildren, 5 boys and 3 girls. And for Kentucky Baptist, Richard will be a keynote speaker at our Shepherding Conference coming up in February, and then also at the Reach Evangelism and Missions Conference coming up in April. So, Richard, let's just jump into these questions. We know you grew up in a Christian home, but how did you come to know Christ?
Well, I was a pastor's kid. My dad was a great man of God, the greatest man of God that I know, and very early age, just sitting in church every week, listening to my dad preach, just had a sense in my spirit that the Spirit of God was just very gently drawing me. And, you know, it's so ironic in a sense, my hearing my dad preach every week that really drew me to Christ. But it was during a revival meeting that I just found myself walking down the aisle, and my dad was standing at the front, received me, led me to Christ. So it was with one of his sermons that I finally made that decision. But I'll tell you, just at an early age, I grew up with a keen awareness God was real. And at some point, even as a little boy, I just knew I had to get that settled early in my life.
Richard, folks know you from your books, your speaking ministry, and more. They also know your dad, Henry Blackaby, and your mom. We follow you on social media and have kept up in many ways with your life and the life of your family. What was it like growing up in the Blackaby home?
You know, it's a very ordinary home in many ways. We didn't have any money. We were a mission pastor, living by faith pretty well most of our growing up years. But my parents, they behaved as if God was real. Mm-hmm. And even though we were in a tiny little house, a tiny little church, no money, my parents always talked like they served the King, and that with God all things were possible. And so, you know, you could kind of look at the surface and say, I'm not sure what the big deal is about the Blackabys. It's nothing all that impressive. But then just God stuff just always happened. I felt like growing up in George Mueller's orphanage of just dad coming home and saying, you guys won't believe what God did today. And so I just grew up with an awareness that God was real and that he did stuff all the time. And you just kind of kept expecting what's the next thing God's going to do. And so it was a wonderful way to grow up as a young Christian.
And what a launching pad to launch into ministry leadership. At what point did you start sensing that God was calling you to Christian ministry leadership?
Well, you know, I used to play church when I was a kid. I used to think it would be really cool to be a pastor. And my brother, just younger than me, he and I would conduct services in our bedroom and force my mother to be our congregation. And I'd be the preacher. My brother led the worship. And 20 or so years later, I was a senior pastor, and the first person I called was that brother to be my worship leader. And
you'd already worked together.
Hopefully, our sermons were a little more advanced by then. But you know, when I got to college, all of a sudden that all became very real, and the sacrifice required. I felt very inadequate, and really entering into university, I was running from God's call. I wasn't running from my faith. I just desperately wanted to have some other calling that didn't require so much of me. I'd watched the price my parents paid, the commitment they had. I just didn't feel like I was up to that. And I didn't think I was the man of God that, you know, I needed to be. And so I was trying to negotiate. I was like, God, I'll be a godly school teacher or do, you know, something else, but don't ask me to be like my dad, be a pastor. And the short story is about halfway through my freshman year, I had perhaps the most terrifying experience of my life. Pretty well my best friend got really involved in some satanic activity. And about 10:30 on a Saturday night, he came to my door, absolutely terrified at what he was experiencing, and came to his best friend to get help. And I was absolutely powerless to help him. And I did everything I could. And I just, when you're running from God, you just don't have any spiritual power. Yep. And finally, it was 2:30 Sunday morning. And I lived at home. I was in the basement of my parents' house, and I had to go upstairs and ask my dad. I woke him up from a dead sleep, 2:30 Sunday morning before church that day, and said, "Dad, you got to get up." He was like, "Richard, can this wait till, this afternoon?" I said, "Dad, trust me. You got to get up." And so he got up. We dragged our friend. He was in a bad place, and we brought him in the living room. My brothers and I, we just ran. We left that young man with the demonic all over him, and we fled into the basement, left him with our dad. And about 30 minutes later, my dad had woken from a dead sleep at 2:30 in the morning to find a young man that had the occult all over him. And 30 minutes later, Dad called us up, and our friend was set free. Calm, peace, joy. And at about 3 o'clock in the morning, my dad had a meeting with his 3 oldest sons and said, "Boys, you just can't be careless with your walk with God, because you just never know who's going to come knock on the door, and you got to be ready. You just have to be ready." Wow. And that next Sunday morning, I walked the aisle, and I just said, I'm Dad, I've been running from God. I'm not running anymore. Whatever he wants, I'm in. And so he actually, I went back and sat down. Like, I thought, okay, I've done the deed. I told my pastor, but Dad stopped the service. He said, "Folks, we've had a young man come this morning. I'd like him just to share what he has." Like, and that's part of why I haven't done this sooner. I didn't speak in public. So I didn't even go back to the front. I was sitting in the very last row. I stood up in front of the whole church, and I just said, "I've been running from God. I'm not running anymore." And I sat down. And before Dad could even speak, another young man jumped to his feet and said, "I've been running from God, and I'm not going to run either." And another guy stood up and said, I know I need to get baptized. And I've been saying no. I'm not saying no anymore." And a revival broke out in that church. Dad started the music back up. The whole altar was filled. And there's at least 5 people in ministry today that surrendered that day after I shared my one sentence of testimony. And so God just kind of confirmed to me, "Richard, the moment you got in the game with me, just look what happened." Yeah. And so it's been a fun adventure ever since, just trying to keep up with God.
I think you've answered one side of this. Maybe I was going to ask, was answering the call, was it made easier or was it made more difficult because of the family that you grew up in? I think I've heard the difficult side of it. You saw what ministry requires. Was there also a part where answering that call was easier because of the family you grew up in?
Yeah, because I admired my dad so much, I just always felt I didn't measure up. Yeah. I couldn't be him. But on the other hand, I also had seen the joys of walking with God, and I without even knowing it, a lot of, if you grew up in a pastor's home, I've had people say, that's worth 5 years at least of seminary. You just because what you observed and you learned just vicariously, and so, the funny thing, my dad had 5 kids. All 5 kids ended up in full-time ministry, like every one of them, and they're still in, all of them. But he never brought it up to us once. Yeah. Never brought until I came forward and told Dad God was calling me. I had never talked to my dad about it. But all 5 kids ended up in there. So I'm glad that I grew up with the heritage I did, because I got to see how it's done right. And I got to see the positives of what it means to be in ministry. But still, some people think, "Oh yeah, all 5 of you ended up in ministry. You must have been pressured all the time." And just the opposite.
And your children as well. And you mentioned that second generation, the third generation. Yeah, so, that's like you've just got your PhD if you're a third generation pastor.
Yeah. So I've got 3 kids. All 3 are in full-time ministry as well. So I didn't want to be the weak link in my family.
Good for you. Hey, take just a minute and talk about in the environment you grew up. Not only that you grew up in, but that you ministered in for much of your adult life, of either feeling like you were being compared to your dad or actually being compared to your dad. How'd you manage that and not be crushed by the weight of it?
Yeah, people can be kind of cruel sometimes. I've asked people a lot of times, would you rather follow a really good pastor in your pastorate, or would you like to follow a bad pastor?
Easy answer.
But yeah, I tell you, I say the same thing with the dad. Even though he was, so many people would tell me he's the greatest man of God that they knew. Yeah. I remember one time my dad had been at a church in Texas preaching, and literally revival just came, and they were still talking about it 5 years later. And so I came to preach about 5 years later. My dad was there last time, and the glory of God fell. And so I preached, and then the pastor had me stand at the front so people could come by. And I was fairly young then, and this one older lady came by, took me by the hand. She said, "Well, son, you're good, but you're not your dad." Yeah. And so I just said, "Well, ma'am," I said, I wish you'd just pray for me. I said, "Pray that I'd even be half the man that my dad is." But I said, "But would you like to know a secret about my dad?" She said, "Sure." I said, "When my dad was my age, he wasn't my dad either."
I love that story.
And I said, he's 26 years older than me. Give me a few more years, So you get that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, I think, wow, it's awesome that a lot of people think my dad was the greatest man of God they ever knew. And boy, I tell you, I could do a lot worse than that.
Yeah, what a legacy. And there's no doubt he was your number one cheerleader and fan in your life, and someone you could counsel with or talk to about any ministry situation. So no doubt the comparison exists, but also no doubt there's great benefit. You and your dad wrote together. You wrote this book, Spiritual Leadership, which is just a great book. I was glancing through some of the things that I highlighted the first time I read it, and it made me think I probably need to sit down and read this again. How did you start writing together, and what prompted this book?
We were asked to write a book. The very first one we ever wrote, I was just in my early 30s. I was a brand new seminary president, and it was a real privilege to get to do that. And after we'd done one or two kind of studies and things together, Lifeway Publishers came to us and basically wanted to sign a three-book contract for me and my dad, which was amazing. And the first one we did was a daily devotional that became very, very popular. But then the second book in the trilogy was going to be leadership, and that was my area. That's what I was passionate about, and so I had kind of claimed that. Said, "Dad, let's write on leadership. I'll kind of glean everything that I can from you, and I'll take all the stuff I've ever read and studied, and we'll put that together." And that book, it has really been wonderful. It's been used as a textbook in all kinds of Christian schools, colleges, seminaries, and all around the world. And it's still, we revised it about 10 or so years after the original came out. That's just been my life study. I got to a church that was down for the count in my first pastorate, and I'd gotten a great seminary education. I hadn't had one class on leadership. The seminary didn't even offer a class on leadership when I went through. And I realized Hebrew was not going to get this church turned around. Yep. I need to know how to lead, and I was never taught how to do that. And so I just began a lifelong study of everything I could read about leadership. And I just believe that it's the key. And so that book, we all of our study, all of our thinking, all of our teaching, put it in there in one place. And so it really represents a lifetime of study for my dad and me, and just what we found to be true when it comes to leading people, and especially God's people.
Richard, are there 2 or 3 key takeaways from that book that you could share with folks, maybe who haven't read it?
Yeah. Our definition of spiritual leadership is moving people onto God's agenda. Mm-hmm. And there's at least 3 really important things in our definition. One is you got to be working off God's agenda, not yours. There's a lot of pastors, a lot of leaders that have their own agenda, and they come to a church and they want to impose it on them, but they've never heard from God. I always tell search committees, if you're talking to a pastor and he already has a plan for your church before he's arrived, get a different pastor. Mm-hmm. You don't want some guy just coming in and imposing his vision, his agenda on your congregation. You want someone that comes in and cries out to God, says, God, your son died for this church. You've known this, you've been at this church from the beginning. I'm just getting here. So God, what's on your heart for this people? Why did you put them together in the first place? And then you begin to move people to where God has always intended for them to be. So, every leader functions on an agenda, but a spiritual leader is going to operate off of God's agenda. And to do that, you have to know what it is. You have to take the time to find what God is on God's heart, and then steer them. But secondly, that definition is moving people. And I'll tell you what, the biggest temptation, I think, for leaders is substituting their agenda for God's. But I would say the greatest frustration for leaders is knowing where God wants the church to go, but being unable to get them there. You're in a declining church that's been declining for years, and no matter what you do, the church doesn't turn around. The church doesn't experience revival. The church attendance continues to decline, or the church continues to be self-centered. You can't get them to be outward focused. You can't get them to be mission-minded. They're still carnal after being lifelong church members. They still aren't behaving like Christ, and it's just so frustrating. And so. But there are ways to move people. That some people use the word influence. I prefer the word move, because a leader takes people where they find them and they move them to where God wants them to be. If you've done your job as a leader, people aren't in the same place anymore. They've moved. They've moved in their behavior. They moved in their attitudes, in their character. If when you leave your church, everything's the same as when you got to it, you haven't led. You've just sort of been some kind of a custodian, but you've not led if people haven't moved. And so I spent a lot of time just studying how is it that God wants to use leaders to move people and to get churches to be the kind of congregations God wants them to be. And then finally, it's just you're moving people. I know people that think they're moving organizations. You're not moving an organization, you're moving individual people.
That's good.
And there's a lot of pastors that actually don't really like working with people. They don't mind getting in the pulpit. They don't mind casting a vision. They find it tedious and exhausting to actually work with people. But leadership is a people job.
Richard,
it's a people business.
I think that every pastor I know believes he's being faithful and believes their church is faithful. How would you help a pastor kind of evaluate and determine whether they're on God's agenda or a different agenda?
Well, one is, as you go to God, do you sense that what God has put on your heart, you're seeing unfold for your people?
Yeah. But
also, is God blessing? Like, God is not obligated to bless your agenda. You could actually achieve your goals and be displeasing to God. We measure leadership by what did you achieve your goals. Well, you're only successful if you achieve God's goals, not yours. And there's a lot of pastors out there getting really frustrated because God is not blessing their efforts. And I would say, well, you're assuming that God's going to bless any effort that is done in His name, but He blesses His will being done, not your will being done. So, one way I just find is when I'm on God's agenda, I'm experiencing God's power. I'm seeing fruitfulness. Fruit is resulting from my efforts. But when I'm on my agenda, I could be working myself to death. I could be burning out for God, and then wonder, God, where's the power? Where's the blessing? And so I tell you, I've done that. I've worked myself my fingers to the bone trying to accomplish my goals, and I'm just tired of doing that. I'm too old to keep wasting my time doing that. So now it's like, God, just show me what you want, and I want your power. I want your blessing. I want your filling. And so just let me know what it is you want me to do. I'm going to make a beeline for that, and then do it in the power of God's Spirit.
Richard, there's an entire generation, 2 generations of people who were not part of the work that your dad did with experiencing God. And I mean, I was at a conference training for another resource, and at that resource they had a little 30-second blip there's this new thing coming out called Experiencing God. You might want to check that out. And we ended up, using that, and God really used it in the church I was pastoring. And then you talk about experiencing God, but there's a lot of folks who just really don't know what that means, or they have their own definition of what they think you mean. What do you mean when you're talking about experiencing God?
Well, essentially, I would just say it is the realization that God is a person. He's not a doctrine. He's not a worldview. He's not a religious system. A lot of times we treat God like he's just a doctrine that you believe in. And it's just a set of doctrines, just assent to these doctrines. But we would be blown away if that, doctrines don't speak to us. Mm-hmm. Doctrines don't convict us. It's just something that you believe in. But a person, you relate to a person on a personal level. And that's one of the things we hear over and over again from people who take the course Experiencing God. They'll say, I've been a Christian for 30 years. I've gone to church all my life. I had no idea that God actually wanted to be personally involved in my life, that he wanted to communicate with me and guide me to when I go to work, to know what to do, to lead me to go on a mission trip. I had no idea that when you worshiped, you weren't just kind of sitting back listening to a sermon, but that God actually wanted to encounter you there. So, yeah, experiencing God means not just believing in God, but actually interacting with him on a personal level. And I'll tell you what, once you've done that, you realize perhaps that you've just been religious all your life, but you've not really experienced God.
Richard, can you give an example to help folks understand maybe a ministry where you were a pastor or as a seminary president, where you needed to experience the Lord, the church did, and you all saw God move in a fresh way?
Yeah, I remember when I had been a pastor, and I was called to be the president of a seminary. And this, of course, and I've been warned, this is a denominational institution. You better lead this well. If you bankrupt this school, you could bankrupt the whole denomination. And a lot of pressure. I was 31 years old when they called me to be the president. I was the youngest person on the entire payroll at the seminary, and I was the boss. But just a series of things happened where all of a sudden God just gave us an opportunity. He put us in front of a bunch of folks in Texas, and the next thing we knew, they said, we're willing to come help you build a building up there, and so we're going to build this big academic building. It's going to cost around $2 million or so, and we don't even have $2,000. And this organization just begins to say, we've always provided labor before, but we feel like God's telling us to help you raise the money. We'll trust you for it. And so we basically built a $2 million building with money coming in week by week, and just having to trust him for it. And I'll tell you what, we dug the hole for the foundation, the basement, and then a series of very negative things happened. The volunteers started arriving at the Canadian border to come up and help us from Texas, and the government just turned them away. Said, you can't come up here and work in Canada. And the whole project is based on volunteers, and it hadn't crossed our mind that Canada wouldn't let volunteers come in and work. And then the money that we did have was going to be wired to us from a donor, and then all of a sudden it's not being wired. The money's not there. And so the biggest undertaking that the seminary's ever done, following the youngest president it's ever had, and the money and the labor are all just evaporating. We got a big hole in the ground. And I remember the denominational leader stopped by, and we're standing there looking at this big hole in the ground. No money, no volunteers, and just saying, do you think you've just made the worst mistake in your life?
Oh, goodness.
Tell you what, I remember calling my dad and telling him what was going on, and he said, if you've ever taken experience in God, you'll recognize this phrase. But he said, Richard, it sounds like you're having a crisis of belief right now. And I said, Dad, don't like, spew your book at me right now.
Don't bring me point number 3 of your live sermon.
And so everybody that worked there, everyone in the denomination is just sitting on the edge of their seat saying, is this going to be the biggest disaster we've ever witnessed? But we said, here's all the things that God did, that he showed us this is what he wanted to do. He's led us all the way here. We just trust he's going to continue. And just a series of just miraculous events took place. And that building was built entirely debt-free. We had over 600 volunteers come in to help us, and just miracle after miracle after miracle, I could tell you. And 600 volunteers, Southern Baptists, flooded that little town of around 5,000 people. And the whole town was buzzing with the gospel witness, and restaurants and all over the place. And it was just the biggest thing that ever happened. And I just watched all the people that work with me, just watching their faith grow, just watching them, all of them just having God stories like they'd never had before. And because as a leader, I stepped out and said, this is what God's agenda is. We got to go for it. Wow. And then watching all the people, the whole town being blessed because we trusted him. And it wasn't easy, but at the end of the day, everybody, I can't tell how many people as they were leaving, like the volunteers, when they'd be going home, they'd be weeping and saying, I've heard of stories like this all my life. I never thought I'd get to be a part of one. And so that's what leadership looks like when you step out in faith and say, listen, God has spoken. We've got to go. Whether we know how it's going to work out, whether we know how we're going to pay for it all or not, we can't stay where we are anymore. And then you watch how it grows your people, and you realize, wow, they probably the greatest moment of their life, just joining in what God was doing.
Richard, are you the kind of person that in that pressure cooker situation that you're describing, I mean, that didn't just all happen in one day, that happened over a period of time. Are you the kind of person that wakes up every day and say, man, we got a big challenge, but I'm just trusting the Lord. It's going to be awesome today. Or are you like, man, I don't know how God's going to come through, and if he doesn't, we're not going to make it.
I'll tell you, I was thinking, I'm too young to be fired already. But back then, I mean, I did have some youthful zeal, youthful excitement, but now I've experienced that enough times that there's always a certain amount of stress because you're always waiting to see how God's going to do it. But you know what? When God has always done it, when God has always provided every solitary time, now when it happens again, it's like, okay, God, how are you going to do it this time? And he always does.
Well, I love all of that. I can't wait for our folks to hear you. Those who attend shepherding. I mean, you're going to be with about 160 Kentucky Baptist Ministry couples there, and they're gonna love your ministry. And then also at Reach, I think we're honoring your dad with a award given posthumously, and folks just get to hear from you. And you're going to talk about revival there as well. So we're very excited to have you in Kentucky. Let me ask you a couple of leadership questions in the time that we have left. Can you tell about one leadership lesson maybe that you had to learn the hard way, Richard?
I've learned lots of them the hard way. One of the struggles I've had, again, you have to be careful because the way you do something is just as important as what you do. You can do the right thing, but do it the wrong way. And so one of my leadership issues at times was when I had to hire somebody, or because I'd put out the word and I'd get some applications, and I would look at all the applications. I'd find the best one, the best resume. I'd interview them and hire them. And then several times I realized I had hired the best person available. I just hadn't hired the best person.
Wow.
And the reason is the best person wasn't yet available.
Yeah.
And I'm the very thing that makes leaders very effective can also be their Achilles heel. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that makes me a good leader is I like closure. I don't like loose ends. Mm-hmm. I don't like I like finishing tasks. And so if I got to hire someone, I want to finish that task. And so sometimes I'd hire the best person I knew about, but I should have waited until I got the right person.
And the Lord helps you with that, right? I mean, like if you're praying, seeking the Lord, there's probably like a check in your spirit that, man, this is a great guy. Everything is good. I'm just not released to do it. Yeah.
Exactly. And I should have listened to that. And the other thing I learned was I should listen to my wife. There's been about 3 times. My wife's never hired anyone in her life, but about 3 times I've been looking at someone, and she maybe went to dinner with me while we were with that candidate. And we'd be going home. My wife would say, "Are you going to hire that guy?" "Yeah, like he's great. He's got an incredible resume." My wife said, "I don't like him. I wouldn't hire him." Yeah. And I could just tell you, every time I haven't listened to my wife, I have regretted it.
Good. That's great advice. Richard, what one piece of advice would you give to younger leaders who are maybe just starting out, trying to figure things out, overwhelmed by their role, possibly, maybe felt compared to someone else? How would you help that guy?
Find someone that can walk with you. Go get help. Don't wait for someone to volunteer. When I was a brand new pastor, there was a veteran pastor on the north side of the city, every time I had to do my first funeral, first wedding, whatever, first time I had someone angrily leave my church, I'd call that guy up, and there's a great Chinese buffet near his church, and he'd say, "You drive on up here, I'll take you for lunch, and we can talk." And I got a prayer partner to meet with me every week, another pastor. I just surrounded myself. I went out and recruited a team around me that I could consult with and pray with. I just knew I couldn't handle it alone. And when I see young pastors sometimes burning out, quitting, shutting down church plants, and then you look around and they didn't reach out to anybody. I mean, all their fellow pastors are caught by surprise because this guy just quit and never even asked for help. It's like, yeah, like you could have gotten help. Like it wasn't as dark as you thought it was, but all alone, just you know, agonizing over the struggles you're having. Like get some people around you, build a team. It's the only way to be effective and to keep growing. And pretty well everything I've ever done, I can tell you who I learned it from. It was always someone that God put around me and taught me what I needed to know that would help me to overcome the challenge that was right in front of me.
And Richard, the same question for older, more seasoned leaders. What piece of advice would you give to someone who's on the latter end, fourth quarter of their ministry, and maybe, I mean, you can keep ministering without being effective at some point if you're not careful. What advice would you give there?
You got to keep growing, growing. I see too many older ministers coasting. I was familiar with a pastor recently that he was just using all of his old sermons, his old illustrations, and I just asked him. I said, "What's the last time you read a book? Like, what's the last time you just had a fresh new study? You're coasting, and that is just. I think it's immoral to be coasting when your people are expecting you to have fresh a word for them every week. If you don't have the motivation to keep digging and coming up with a fresh word, then you need to step aside. You need to find some other work. But I'll tell you what, just always have a book. Sometimes I'll test older ministers and I'll ask them, what book are you reading right now? What book is really getting you excited? What podcast are you listening to? There's lots of ways to keep thinking, keep learning. But man, if you can't answer that question, if you stop learning, then that means you stop growing. And that means you started dying. So keep on growing. And I mean, right to the last moment, have a book at your fingertips, a new study that you're engaged in, a new sermon series you've never done before. But you owe it to your people. And so keep on growing. You owe it to the glory of God, that you want to be still running hard when you hit that finish line and not just kind of loping along for the last couple of laps.
Richard, thank you for these questions. I can't wait to see you in Kentucky and have you here for our folks to get to hear from you and hear what God's done in your life. And thank you for your ministry, your family, and thank you for taking the time to join this conversation.
It's great to be with you.
Thanks for listening to Leadership Lessons. An audio podcast of this program is available on both Apple and Android devices. The Kentucky Baptist Convention was created by churches, for churches, to help churches reach Kentucky and the world for Christ. For more information about the KBC and the cooperative program which fuels our ministry, go to kybaptist.org. We'll see you next time on Leadership Lessons.